Hello, and welcome to the October 2025 ENSO Seminar. So this is a little bit different to our normal setup because, as it happens, October 2025 is the 10-year anniversary of the ENSO seminars. Myself and Matthew kicking off the first one, I think I think it was the 8th of October 2015. So my, how the time flies. But I am delighted to be joined by a number of speakers from across the inactive spectrum, as it were, from a range of different voices in which we will engage in some participatory sense making. We're going to get it going, just hoping to have something of a free-flowing conversation that is meant mostly just to be an interesting conversation relevant to enactive cognitive science, but also a little bit of taking stock about the status of the approach and looking at to sort of draw on a phrase from our history, the horizons of enactive cognitive science as they currently stand, the kinds of challenges that are currently faced by people working in the discipline in terms of the theoretical and other forms of development of the approach. So with that, I will welcome, and I'm just going to go in the order in which people appear on the screen here. So hopefully everyone can see everyone here. So uh, I'm just looking. I have two different screens, and in fact they're in two different orders. But for me, Lara Mahica is up first. Lara is at currently postdoc in is it San Sebastian or Basque Country? It is San Sebastian you're in,
It
Mahik.
is San Sebastian, and it's
Yeah,
part of the Basque Country, so we're
very
both are
good.
right.
And so with I'll go clockwise. Matthew should require no introduction, as it were. Matthew is co-convener of the seminars, and is the reason everything still works after 10 years. Matthew is in Auckland in New Zealand, and so is already in tomorrow and deep into caffeine. What
Cheers.
we will, that's it. Um, So this is by far our most ambitious time zone spread, actually, of any ENSO seminar, as we'll get to in just a moment. Um, Beside Matthew here for me is Ezekiel Di Paolo. Ezekiel is at also in the University of the Basque Country in San Sebastian, and uh, from the other end of the time zone scale, Hannah Diar is in Canada, and not just anywhere in Canada. It's almost as far west as you can go. So we have a quite. I haven't actually done the mathematics, but it's got quite the time scale range. We're teasing Hannah because she's got a certain temporal privilege at present. She's possibly the person with the most humane time zone at present. Hannah has a choice of caffeine or some other beverage. Uh,
Mhm.
and in the middle with us here in Europe is also Sanika Dahan. And thanks everyone for your patience and your commitment and your willingness to join us today.
Thanks for organizing this, Merritt.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
So, okay, so I mean we sort of have a few things we've considered in advance, just a few possibilities for prompting the discussion, see where it gets going, doing a little bit of reflection on the state of enactive cognitive science and some of the implications of it and some of the challenges that are coming up. And I will be keeping an eye on the YouTube chat and try and fold in comments there or questions as they come up, although I don't promise to be doing so with um, great fluency or speed. It will depend a little bit on just how things are flowing. So um, we're here. We're about if we consider the embodied mind to be the kind of inaugural text. There's obviously a prehistory, as it were. There's a long, decades-long period of development up to the publication of the embodied mind in 1991. One of the principal elements of that, of course, being the principles of biological autonomy from sort of 12 years prior, which also has been given a refresh and reintroduction more recently. But we're, 34 years into a cognitive science that uses the term in action. and an approach to thinking about how the mind works and what life is doing when it's getting on with itself. And I guess it's the question of where we feel we are and what some of the major implications might be. So, Hannah, I might invite you actually. So, you had an observation just as before we were coming online here as to some of the interesting implications or something that's be interesting to explore on this one. So, I'll ask you to sort of open the floor, as it were.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Marek, and hi everyone. Yeah, so I thought I think many of the themes that will come up in this conversation always meaning stream through each other, and you already mentioned it'll depend on how things are flowing, and this is one of those things. It's like a seed, and then so many other things will also flow into and weave into the conversation. But I think one of the things that runs through the enactive approach is how it is a listening epistemology, or an epistemology of trying to enter into interaction with the phenomena that we are researching and enter into a relation. And that has many different implications. When we are researching phenomena, especially phenomena of cognition, we enter into a relation with other beings who are cognizers, sense makers. And we, as humans, as sense makers, have a certain sensitivity to that and a certain interest in entering into those kinds of interactions. And so I think it relates also to the ethical question of how can we be careful with what we are interacting with and who we are interacting with. But that is not only a one-way street, it's also a two-way interaction, and it has implications for who we are as researchers and how what we do in this research impacts us and how we can live together. The people researching and the people being researched, but in a much wider way, humanity and also the more than human world as well, how we relate with that as well. And so I think that cognitive science and also enactive cognitive science also bring us news of ourselves. And this is an expression I got from an article that Amy Cohen-Varela and Francisco Varela wrote together, where Amy talks about how Francisco brought her news of herself. But I think it also means that when we interact in certain ways with the world, this tells us something about who we are. And to give a quick example, because I don't want to speak too much, but in autism research, as it's been done in cognitive science since maybe a central point in the 1980s, the news of ourselves that the science of autism brought to, I think, to cognitive scientists who were researching then was that they were not in relation with autistic people. They were investigating autistic people kind of over there, predetermined by a theory, the theory of mind, and this is what characterized autistic people. And autistic people were characterized as not able to interact very well. But actually, the researchers themselves, I think, were also showing, in a way, their lack of understanding or their lack of possibility to interact with autistic people. And I think one of the things with enactive cognitive science is that we are trying to make a change in that, or becoming aware of that and remaining aware of that in the interactions that we have with those we study, or really better said, those we participate in sense making with. And so there is this idea that we have to care for that and that we can care for that and do that in principled ways. And I also think that it relates to how many people in the world find some affinity with enactive cognitive science because they feel recognized as participants in their endeavors in the enactive cognitive science. So for me, one of the challenges is to bring that forward in more different domains and to, create community or be in community with care for all of that as researchers, as facilitators, as teachers. Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me as something that that's not just a challenge for, but a challenge of enactive cognitive science, isn't it? I mean, it really is taking on board or engaging directly with a a view of what science is that is dramatically at odds with an awful lot of a view of science that an awful lot of scientists are very deeply committed to and kind of hold on to with great vigor. Essentially, for an awful lot of scientists, the objectivity, the distance, and the separation are virtues of science. They are precisely the things that you want to maintain and enact. But for enactive cognitive science, this is something that breaks the relationship. And just having that different view of science and communicating effectively through it is something that is certainly a challenge for enactive cognitive science, but also it's something that is increasingly and has for decades been very clearly given an empirical ground in science and technology studies and the history and philosophy and the sociology of science. We have been showing with empirical evidence for decades that this is like that. We can't do the pure objective thing, but that seems to be some empirical evidence that scientists don't want to hear. That somehow it's like either it's wrong or it's an indication that we're not quite doing science perfectly yet. Um, and so I guess there's in keeping with inactive thinking, there is this nice dialectic then between a personal, a humane science, the kind of listening epistemology that you were talking about, Hannah, and the need to transform not just the way in which we go about science, but our concept of what constitutes good science.
Uh, yeah, on that topic, I think that it's time for Inaction to say something about how science is actually constituted and how these spaces of dialogue and listening are shaped, and how can we be critical about them. So recently, I've been working on recognition as part of what happens in those spaces where we build knowledge, where we see who has the right and who has the right argument to say what we're doing and to set the agenda of the science. And precisely because we have this objective idea and this idea of a knower that is detached, a knower that is not transformed by what he does and is mainly a he, we don't have a clear idea of what we can actually realistically aim for when we do science. So yeah, I think that by thinking of the inactive subject as someone that does knowledge and comes into these relationships that become of recognition that become explicit, we can show the structure of how this is happening through, for example, recognition, through participatory sense making, and so on. And I think that our great allies here could be feminist philosophers of both science and argumentation. So there is amazing work of recently I learned about Lorraine Coate, and she uses precisely the, the topics and the spirit of enacted knowledge, of enacting a point of view that is coming to an arena of argumentation and of listening and so on. And she puts this very clearly. And now we have here a much robust understanding of what an agent is and what knowledge and how this transforms us, that we can do a much finer diagnosis of how this knowledge is happening, and then, yeah, be more aware of the more ethical ways of doing that, just as Han was outlining.
I'd just like to add to this that some people listening to this might be forgiven for maybe interpreting what is being said as something like we are anti-science, like science is just wrong and that we have to just simply do something else. But I think the spirit of what's been discussed here is quite the opposite, is that we need better science. And you know, getting, holding on to certain very abstract principles of science, as you mentioned, objectivity and so on, just works fine for certain questions, and that's fine. But for other questions, we need a more sophisticated science. It's not an abandonment of science. Some of the questions and problems that we are discussing when we are doing research might be translated into a laboratory study, but others probably not. And then we have to just come up with new methodologies, a combination of existing methodologies that were not typically used in cognitive science to say, like, what the problem requires, and this is what the listening part is about, what the problem requires is a different perspective. And this is not to say that we don't want to have a knowledge that we can rely on that has virtues. Objectivity could be a virtue of what we're trying to understand. Being humane could be another virtue, and so on. Being ethically relevant or practically relevant could be. There are many different virtues in the path to knowing, and not just the one. And there is this connection between science as this strong word and detachment, objectivity, and so on. Well, it's not necessarily quite like that. And the problem is, in fact, that when you think that it must be so, then you're forcing the question into a mold that it doesn't fit. And I've seen so many times that they want to design a laboratory study that essentially makes no sense. Case in point, recently, I've got a PhD student who's working on linguistic relativity, and it's a big topic, the relation between language and cognition. And then he's been reviewing all the empirical work that has been going on over the last couple of decades. And in order to make a lab study, when they make, I don't know, I can't remember the details. They project words, they see whether people look right, look left. The question becomes so abstract that has nothing to do with the original question. And that is like, well, it's that the original question is much more complex, and you need a combination of methods. There is no need to say, well, if it is in a lab study, it's simply not right. If it is an fMRI picture, is just literature. Okay, that is simply not is falling for an abstraction rather than the concreteness of knowing, and knowing in order to. It's not detached knowing. It's knowing in order to do something with it, to help people to understand a question better, to have something that we can discuss our predicaments more with a firm ground, and so on and so forth. So it's not being anti-science. That's the one point I want to make.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
anything, it seems like maybe it fits in with other movements that are going on around the world as well at the moment, right? Where, I don't know, at least at the university I'm at, we're encouraged more and more for our science to be driven by engagement with community. Um, and I don't know, more abstractly, the focus in research over the past several decades on complex systems is acknowledging the fact that the idea of varying one independent variable to see how that affects one other dependent variable isn't going to show us everything we need to know about the system, and that maybe we need more sophisticated ways for interacting with the systems that we're studying. I don't know, I just think it's interesting to think that maybe Enaction is fitting in with a larger zeitgeist of approaches to understanding with the world that are becoming gradually more sophisticated over time.
yeah. And I think one of the central tensions that I think also comes to the fore in Enaction and active theory is that it, on the one hand, starts from the very assumption that we are situated beings, right? That we have a situated perspective, and this at the same time, so we have this engaged epistemology. We care about things, that we engage with certain questions and with certain people in these questions. And I think for me, a central tension is that on the one hand, the situatedness of the perspective also means that you have to be very, have a epistemic humility in the sense of what you can assume for anyone else, right? And I think in that respect, it's also interesting that quite a few thinkers from an active perspective have drawn on Levinas to sort of make that connection with the philosopher Levinas, who really stresses that. While at the same time, I think if you take that too far, if there's no ground, if you can just only if there's total otherness that you just have to respect and cannot engage with, then what does knowing still entail? Then it's not engaged either, right? So and I think this is very interesting that maybe I would suspect that actually enactive thinking also might give us some basis for thinking of what is shared, even though this is, of course, from the history, a total dangerous thing to assume shared characteristics across human beings, so to say. But yeah, so I see also that as a sort of central tension in engaging in this way.
Yeah, I think that it brings us news of ourselves means that also we are a self or a being with interests and so on, and not taking part in a way of completely disappearing by trying not to determine too much is like you say, is also not, and then you lose the ability to know.
Yeah.
It's there's this sort of tension between analytic and synthetic modes of sort of approaching a question, and the inactive approach would tend to orient a person so that they're asking questions about, well, how is this arising within a context, so that you're looking at the whole at first, and then trying to sort of see how the whole articulates itself into different kinds of parts, which runs directly counter to the kind of elementalist thinking that so much of the rest of, science generally, but it's certainly true within the domain of psychology, which is just like you were describing, Ezekiel. You bring something into the lab in order to identify what the elementary components in it might be, in the hope that once you have the elements, like you figured out what Lego bricks exist, you can figure out how to put the Lego bricks together.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're talking about something that arises within a flow of activity that was there before it started, you can't depend on there being that set of elementary characteristics that are, the same across the board or in every context. And it's a very challenging shift in perspective, because this analytic view of let's start with individuals and makes things more complicated by adding more individuals, rather than saying, actually, we start with a society and we make individuals in a society, and it takes years. It's really difficult, and the kids still don't get it properly. Every generation just does individuality a bit differently, and they're very annoying, in that they don't join in the same way that we joined in. But for example, when I try to teach this, that shift in perspective is basically, that's where my students check out, which is very early on, right? So they kind of just go, "What? I don't know. What do you even do here? So what are the tools that we can get to?" And so I've just the very shallowest grasp of some of the basic concepts of dynamical systems theory and the various tools that are in that toolbox, along complexity and chaos and all the rest of it. Do we have to start with those tools? Are these the kinds of tools that at some point I'm going to have to teach to an undergraduate psychology student, given that t-tests break them? I'm a little bit, I'm not terribly optimistic about how I'm going to do that. But or are there other sets of tools that might make this easier when it comes to drawing diagrams or pictures or modeling this in different ways?
I mean that's a great question. I mean, I want to maybe say a few things first, which they have to do with what you were saying about the difference between an enactive way of thinking or approaching a problem and a very analytic way of thinking. And again, like with my previous comment, I don't want to say analytic thinking is, we should forget about it. In fact, in the book Linguistic Bodies, we adopt very consciously a dialectical method for precisely approaching it, such a big question as what is language, right? And in the dialectical method, what we have are analytic phases, when you analyze the concept as it is, and you start working out that things don't fit together, that there are contradictions. And then you say, well, okay, let's see how we can distill this and give them names and understand them. That's very much analytic philosophy, if you like. You can really put that in categories. And then there is a sort of synthetic phase which has to do with what has happened in history, how were these tensions dealt with that we know of, and so on, if at all, and so on and so forth. And so what happens there is that instead of working with simple building blocks and trying to build complexity, what you do is to work with first, whole concepts that may be a bit abstract, may still not be quite what we're looking for. It may be that it's not very clear how they relate to all our worries and the things we want to understand. But they kind of form a sort of organic whole. And then you start thinking, well, how does this idea develop? And it keeps moving very much like I keep having in mind those snapshots of a developing fetus from the fertilized egg, and then they keep just getting more complex and more complex and more complex. And I think that's the way that I think implicitly the enactive thinkers have thought in the past, and now at least some of us do it more or less explicitly. And then of course after that, regarding tools, it's almost like if it fits, it's fine. I mean, if it really helps within this context to use dynamical systems to make a model like the models that Matthew makes, or to use information theory, to use a computational, it doesn't matter provided it fits. And then we can say, well, we use it knowing why we're using it, not just because it's the only tools I have on the shelf and then I apply it everywhere. And that's fine. So I think maybe that's connecting to the generic aspect of your question, not so much about what you actually should teach, but it's a way of viewing the problem a bit differently. And in the history of enactive approach, you will notice this because, for a long time, people are talking about living cells, like the autopoiesis and blah, autopoiesis this and that and that. And how do we get to language? How do we get to something more interesting if you're not interested in biology? And maybe it's because it's this development that's happening, and it keeps happening. It's still happening. And it's a different form of knowing. And it has all the things that were said before, about how you are engaged in this, because who is doing all this? Is the idea on its own that is developing? No, it's you and the idea and the community and the world that all orchestrating this development. So yeah, it is a different way of thinking, but probably it's the way of thinking that is demanded by the questions we ask.
Yeah, I think the way to teach some of these ideas varies so much depending on who you're teaching them to. I remember sort of in my early days as a graduate student at Sussex, the papers that sort of made me finally start to understand some basic elements of enaction were model papers. So it was like the 1974 paper, the cellular automaton model of autopoiesis. As someone with like a background in computer science, I could get that idea. I could see all of the moving parts, and finally I got the idea of, a network of interdependent components and things. And then also Randy Beer's 2004 paper that was looking at autopoiesis in the game of life. And it was accessible to me because of my background. And I guess for all of us trying to introduce these ideas to the next generation, so to speak, that's got to be part of our strategy, I suppose. Like I teach a course at Auckland where I am trying to introduce those papers to the students and others, but also a lot of the kinds of material that we learned about at Sussex. So evolutionary robotics, just as ways to get people to stop thinking computationally, to stop thinking quite so reductively, And then those are intended as sort of gateway drug papers for the even more exciting ideas that that we get to talk about. Might be fun to have a nice repository of materials or methods or something like that, or even a paper I can imagine that a large number of people authored talking about ways that they teach these ideas. Because I bet there's overlap, but I bet there's also a lot of different good ideas.
Yeah. And potential project to follow up. We'll
It's
be in
interesting.
touch.
Yeah, it's interesting, Matthew, that those were your gateway papers. They were not for me. For me, it was
Yes, yeah.
yeah, not at all. I mean, for a philosopher, for me, Weber and Varela's 2002 was perfect. Like I see where we're going here. But I also think that there is something important happening in Inaction now. That is, we're coming to more concrete realities, just as we were speaking at the beginning, and then both linguistic bodies and social motor life allow me to think in more concrete terms. And by concrete, I mean in Ezekiel terms, of much more situated in my life and other people's life, that I can see that these ideas are kind of taking life. And that was very good for me for understanding what this is about and what's the spirit of the philosophy and the cognitive science and the general approach that we have, that we want to come back to life, like to our lives and to other lives. So that was, yeah, depending on the way how you get to it, which is, as we said, very different for different people. It's about this, like coming to the concreteness of life.
It strikes me, I guess there's two things really that come out of that. One is the vital importance of interdisciplinarity and pluralism, and that there's a kind of two aspects to pluralism. One, of course, is these multiple perspectives, but the other side of it is what Seneca mentioned, which is this greater humility about what knowing actually means. So our knowing is always, in this kind of more pluralistic perspective, knowing is always more specific and context bound than these kind of universal general laws that form the aspirations of certainly of the biggest domains of science, where they don't talk about so much about the grand theory of everything anymore, but that is nevertheless this kind of overarching ambition for some scientists and some science. Whereas in essence, there's a sense to which we have to kind of give up on that. There's no one grand description that we can reach, but if we learn to talk to each other between us, we can do really amazing things. I mean, my favorite example of this, actually, it's something I just cite it left, right, and center now, is Hasok Chang has this lovely illustration about the pluralism in science that's so often unrecognized, but vital to making things work. So if you use GPS, you are using a system of satellites that have been launched and are maintained using Newtonian physics. On board these satellites are atomic clocks, which depend on quantum mechanics. Those clocks are synchronized, and the synchronized adjustments are made using the theory of relativity in order to calculate the position on the surface of a globe, which is then communicated to a user in flat Earth terms. And all of these things are mutually exclusive, right? No one of these perspectives can be integrated fully with any of the other perspectives, except that they work brilliantly, right? We have become utterly dependent on this technology, and so the pluralism of science is not something to fear; it's something to figure out how to do better.
Mm.
But again, it is that sort of it does involve a certain shift in perspective and a greater it does involve that humility, that sense of, well, maybe my little bit's okay. It doesn't have to be everything, but it's good for this.
It's interesting for me to think about how the limits of our ability to understand things fits into that story that you just told, Marek. Is sort of in theory, maybe all of that could be done using, I don't know, relativity or something like that, some really high level description. But that's not the easiest way for us to think about it, right? Like in the most obvious level, when you're talking about the flat Earth representation of where we are, that's really sculpted to be compatible with the way that we like to think about where we are on Earth and how to drive from A to B. And I think the same is probably true for all of those other frameworks for describing things, right? It's like what's easy for us to understand and summarize really constrains the kinds of descriptions that we come up with. And that's often, I think, sort of forgotten about, or we pretend that that's not the case. You know, that science really is objective, that it operates independently of what we are as human beings. And that's, of course, one of the things that enactivists are trying not to do in this conversation as well. Yeah.
There's also an element of it, of how not knowing is never finished. And maybe in previous ways of doing cognitive science, at least, the idea was we can reach this thing and it'll be finished. So we will understand this. But actually what streams through what enactive work is that you don't know certain things, but you will not know them differently the more you move along trying to know them. And this different knowing gives you more knowledge, and or sometimes maybe also less knowledge, but you keep moving, and then yeah, the way you know things changes. And that's important and makes it accessible from different perspectives as well. It's not just we are humble or we have different perspectives. We are pluralist about, but also that means that the thing that you know changes as well as you take these different perspectives, and the knowing keeps going, which is an enactive principle based on the logic of living beings continuing living and continuing self-producing, and knowledge also, as it's done by living beings, moves onwards as we engage with it and as we engage with each other and with our objects or subjects.
There is a sense that if you compare the drive that characterizes traditional science or our caricatures of science it's almost like a colonial kind of endeavor. No, we're covering more and more and more. We're putting everything together under the same umbrella. And this is like the metaphor of the limits of knowledge is precisely a spatial metaphor. What's behind that thing that we don't know, and so on and so forth. Where what Hannah is saying, it makes me think that the horizon is always in the thing, in the experience. You can keep on knowing the same thing over and over again, and to some extent you will know new things. And in knowing, things will change, and then these changes are not predictable, and therefore there is an inner horizon that makes you say like, oh, I can be increasingly more and more connected and more in relation to the things I know without ever stopping. So which is, I find it more interesting, less boring than trying to just simply cover everything with one umbrella. Is the progression of knowledge is open-ended, rather than, oh, there will be an end once we know all these things. No, it's more like it's a creative, apart from being an epistemic act that you get to know the world. It's also a creative act, because the knowing, the further understanding, the conversations you have about it starts changing the world. And therefore, the world is now a different one to be known again.
No. What I also find sort of difficult, or something at least that I find very interesting, but also difficult, is the sort of ethical side of things, that not in all this pluralism, not every way is equally good, maybe. But on what basis could we say that? Basis is already suggests already, like, as if there is this sort of this fundament or this essence that we can. It's not that I mean it that way, but how do we distinguish between also better ways or some worse ways of doing things? And Yeah, because I do think that the inherent good of pluralism and of diversity does not have to entail a relativism, a sort of an ethical relativism, like as if any perspective should be acknowledged or embraced or something like that. Yeah, and in a sense, I think in what you, Hannah, and Ezekiel just said, and what you also describe in your enactive ethics paper, I think also is that there is already a value. I think there's also already this value of that development is itself already a virtue, so to say. That's one of the, at least that's how I understood it. This is one way of thinking in terms of like, okay, what could be sort of, yeah, it's difficult because if you, as soon as you talk about the basis or principles or whatever, so you immediately think in these sort of like, here come these deontological categories or something like that. But still, I find this really worthwhile to think about. That's what are our ethical or sort of normative aspects of this knowing.
I think it's well, one question to ask coming from that is how can we continue going on with each other? How can we continue in relation as we know each other, as we know our research subject? So, for instance, climate crisis or something. How can we continue in relation with a particular place that's being damaged or something out of the way we are knowing it ongoingly?
Yeah.
You know, what is the kind of knowing that we can do that where each element in the relation of knowing can continue becoming, and also the relation is also able to continue going on, is a way to track maybe what are good ways of knowing and what are ways of knowing that we should actually leave behind.
Yeah.
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 In that, because you mentioned that paper, Sonneke, and I think there was a struggle in that paper to stay away from trying to use words like principles
Yes. Yeah. No,
and
you
so on.
don't do that. Yeah.
And for one good reason, which is that you shouldn't expect an ethical dilemma to be solvable by one theory in embodied cognition. It's a problem that we are all immersed in, and maybe we will be informed by ideas about who we are or so on. Some will be better, others will be worse. But at the same time, we are invested and we will act and maybe take risks in our decisions as situated beings and not just simply but because I'm following,
Yeah.
a list of recommendations. So there was a kind of like, careful, we don't want to say that enactive problems are the problems that you can easily solve by just looking at like a principle. In fact, it's almost, I tend to think that ethical problems are the problems that are essentially never solvable that way. A real ethical problem is that you have no guidance. You have to really create the new step to try to say, well, I think based on whatever I have, that this is the right thing to do, and then maybe I'm right, and maybe not. And then you have to maybe take responsibility if you were not right. So all of that does not actually, the other pole of the tension is that the enactive theory shouldn't tell you what to do, but doing things inactively, like we were saying earlier, a particular way of knowing, of listening, and so on, suggests a certain, prescriptive. Uh, it has a certain prescriptive status, we're suggesting that this is the right way to approach certain problems,
Yeah.
and then maybe like how can we continue together? What are the best ways to participate when that's possible? Sometimes it isn't. Maybe these are the things that are derived not so much from the body of what is being said, but rather from the way in which it is adopted. Although the dichotomy or the differences, yeah, it's not so strict. The method and the subject. Um, but yeah, I do think that thinking inactively or acting and actually it's a useful thing in our current times. It's advantageous to our times to have a certain practice in not reducing knowledge to fixed categories that are given, and therefore we renounce the possibility of being told by somebody else that no, our categories are a bit different, we have a different problem, and we just simply, well, you're wrong. No, essentially we should simply say like, oh, maybe we should adapt and listen to each other. I think that is what we need.
Yeah.
That's,
Yes, because there is a normativity involved, of course, in an enactive way of handling things, which I think is inevitably so. And yeah.
I think, though, there is, I mean, it's an interesting issue for me that these normativities, because they are nested within one another, they can sometimes come into really quite significant conflict. And so while the principle of, well, let's you and I find a way to continue on together and find a way to orient sort of in some kind of resonance to the world rather than in a way that's kind of destructive or likely to result in schism or separation or just nothing but distinction. That individual interaction, as it's simplistically described there, can nevertheless be occurring within the sort of the tides of much bigger social forces. And so you have massive power differentials in those kinds of interactions, which can be very, very difficult to handle. I mention frequently as well these days. There's a PhD thesis by a Australian student or student in an Australian university in Wollongong, Naomi Beecroft. Is the student, her PhD thesis was precisely on the limits of enactive ethics because of its incapacity to cope with these massive power differentials and the genuinely oppressive forces and the possibility. So as it's described, inactive interactions are replete with tensions, which are small conflicts that are rubbing up against each other that need to be resolved on a continuous basis. And so there is a necessary component of tension and conflict inherent there, but there's a sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit notion of pacifism, that kind of letting the conflict dissolve is what we want to do, whereas in the immediate case that might not be the case. So what Beecroft does is unpack the question of whether or not there is occasions where you do want to punch the Nazi, and in fact that it is the ethical thing to do, that there is a time for ethical violence, and the concern that without being able to acknowledge those forces, then the inactive approach becomes this kind of milquetoast, really pacifist view of constantly just, well, let's just de-escalate. And on the one hand, it's kind of, I would generally hold to such a view, but we also have to appreciate where its limits are, and that, as I said, when you have nested conflicts, resolving the conflict at one level can make the larger one worse, or vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Sanneke, do you want to go?
Oh, you go first.
Yeah, I don't think it's just nested conflicts or nested norms, but also, we are always in different relations, and the different relations that we're in can contradict each other, and one relation can demand that we stop another relation of knowing, and so on. And so by saying finding out how we can go on with each other, I don't mean to make things harmonious or anything like that, because sometimes you do have to make a cut and say this, no, and you either delete it or fight it. I definitely think we need to fight certain things, but also in order to have other things continue together. So racism, discrimination, absolutely fight it. That but that is for living relations to be able to continue, right? And an active approach takes a stance. Sometimes there is also an idea that taking an active approach is actually trying to not take a stance so that things can continue, or we have a dialogue and anything goes, but that's really not what it is. I think an active ways of doing things take a stance and are for certain things and against other things, and we take a specific route in which we approach problems very clearly. I mean, the idea that it's milk toast, I actually want to punch it.
Yeah,
But
it
I think
seems to
it's
me
like what Ezekiel was saying earlier about just the scientific tools, right? It's a sort of similar kind of thing, which is know why you're using it, know why you're taking a particular stance in a given situation,
exactly, yeah.
be
I
capable of
was
reflecting and sort of adapting as
uh,
appropriate.
yeah, I was going to emphasize that and connect it to the thing I said earlier that don't expect the active perspective to sort out your problems. You have to solve your problems too. You know, you have to actually take a stand, and 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 I assume that many people think that perhaps it's a good guidance for knowing certain things about your problems, but not everything, and you can't know everything. So, and you're also a situated concrete being that you cannot tolerate certain things, and what is interesting is that what the negative perspective is telling you is like, well, move forward with your plan for revolution or whatever it is, but with certain awareness of what's happening in the process and what's going to happen to you as you go along, so that you don't, become the thing you're fighting, for instance, or yeah, or you forget to self-criticize, or you forget your origins, that you say you're fighting for certain things, the typical cognitive dissonance of the revolutionary leader who ends up having a position in government and and ends up essentially being transformed by the institution into a neoliberal suit. And whereas that forgetting is it can be brought forward by precisely the kind of things which they're saying, that the engagement, a serious heart-to-heart conversation with that person would be like, don't you notice that something has happened to you? And for that, enactive ideas about participation and opening and so on can be fruitful. Even talking to a Nazi, eventually you say like, why are you saying these things? What's going on?
Yeah.
And if there is an opening on the other side, perhaps something happens. If not, well, fine, punch them, if that's your inclination. But nothing is being said about resolving things just through the enactive ethics or any ethical theory, and none of them can do that.
Yeah, but I also think an element in this, which is again brings also our responsibility as researchers or as participants, as human beings, but also as researchers, is that how we the words and concepts we use to analyze certain situations also make a difference. So if we sort of highlight there's this conflict and we have to fight this and that, if we use that kind of language, then we're also sort of we're also shaping or enacting a certain way of seeing things. So I will certainly look up her work. So I didn't know that. So I certainly look it up. But it also made me think of a paper by Monica Greco, who is a sociologist, and she wrote a paper on analyzing a debate on that was then called medically unexplained physical symptoms. That has now different terms, persistent physical symptoms. And one of the things she brought forward there was in reference actually to Foucault, that she compared morality of polemics with an ethics of engagement. And I thought it was such a helpful way in which a morality of polemics is very much on who has the right to say something, where the very way in which the whole debate is set up is that both parties don't recognize each other's, the validity of each other's knowledge, or from the start, so to say, that's sort of enemies. Whereas from an ethics of engagement point of view, it would rather be that we're all partaking in the same world, but of course each with their own perspective, but with striving for an engagement. And you can easily say then again, like, oh, it doesn't mean that engagement should mean that you just soften over anything or just agree with anything. I mean, I think it actually entails what you just said, Hannah: discrimination, racism, all these kinds of that makes an ethics of engagement impossible. I think that's the sort of preconditions for an ethics of engagement. But yeah, so I also feel that what kind of rhetorics are we enacting also ourselves, so to say?
That's also, the definitions that we made, like the definition of social interaction, where we have two or more autonomous agents interacting, and this interaction takes on an autonomy of itself, and the interaction of the agents should not be destroyed. That's a definition that we proposed in order to look at the particular concrete situations and see, is there still social interaction here? What are the agencies or the self-organizations that each participant can have? And definitions at that level allow to look at specific situations and get clarity on what's going on in those situations. And so that allows to lay ethical issues out in a way that looks at what is possible here in terms of relations, in terms of what it does to each participant. And I think I was reminded of that because, Ezekiel, what you said about how we need to look at the specifics of things. And I think providing theorizing concepts and so on, and then teaching them to people, so that process can be helped, is important. Yeah, and I think that opens up for more possibilities of this really sophisticated and often very difficult engaging. Yeah, where things are at stake and things clash into each other.
Mm-hmm.
But being able to move through those, knowing that they will keep evolving, using enactive definitions is helpful, I think, or hope. I mean,
it seems to me that there is indeed it's not a principle. It might be polemic what I'm going to say, but there is a rule of thumb of how to go on in this, how we can keep with each other, how we continue with each other. Because one of the things that we don't want to do is, of course, to destroy the autonomy of the other, but that's a bit too little to ask for an interaction. But we also want to have this mutual constraining and enabling that is really difficult to achieve, right? So I would say that it's very clear that if this is not happening in interaction for you, then you just leave. Or if you're inclined to punch the other, you continue there. And you examine yourself in those terms, whether you're imposing into the world this overdetermination or this denying of the autonomy or the proper evolving of the other or not. That's quite useful as a rule of thumb, and that can give you a basic way in, and then it becomes a question of how you do in the specific question that you're asking, not in the principle that will solve all your questions as the was doing. But I do feel that if you put on the work of putting this down into your life and into the concrete situation, it tells you things about how to go on. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that it's everything peace and love about enactive ethics.
Yeah. I've tried to cash that out in terms of a sort of a balance of expression and impression, or something like that. You need to both express yourself and show yourself in order for there to be an interaction with someone else, right? But at the same time also be affected by the other and listen and be changed. And I think this is actually quite difficult to, not if you take up too much space. If you're only expressing yourself, you're making all the other people sort of pushing them to the side. Whereas if you don't say anything and you just make yourself very small, and then there's no interaction either, right? So there has to be kind of, I think, a sort of balance there. Yeah. And also this also implies a responsibility, right? Not just for your own behavior, but also the way in which you, by interacting with others, actually take part in other people's being. Yeah.
And translating that to a question of science, if you're gonna, for example, investigate into women's health, I'm shocked by this that I saw a week ago. There was this research on endometriosis and the attractiveness of women, of females, which is it's terrible knowing that endometriosis is such a little research topic that is so painful for so many women. And then what people researching that decide to see how attractive these women are. So I think this is an example in which this being open to see what's happening to the research objective that you have is not happening. This, I mean, the concerns of these women that are suffering with endometriosis were completely annihilated in that kind of research. And that's where you can have the tools of an activism telling you, this is not the kind of research that we need to do, right? It's, and then, yeah, I see the image of women being very little there, like overdetermined by this research was powerful.
What was the research question then? I don't understand.
Whether women with endometriosis are more attractive, tend to be more attractive than women who don't have that. And the answer was yes, they tend to. And yeah, that's a published paper, funded research.
Weird.
Yeah.
And was it sort of then rationalized with some sort of evolutionary talk or something?
Yeah,
or
yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
yeah, okay, yeah.
Deep sigh.
Yeah.
I guess a big thrust of the discussion over these last few minutes, I think, gets at that idea of why the likes of, for example, Evan Thompson is very keen to use the phrase inactive approach rather than inactivism. That it's a means of orienting and engaging with the world rather than a sort of rigid framework that must be used to interpret the world in according to a given set of relationships, and so that fundamental openness and unfinishedness it's a hard habit to get into. It's a sort of big shift in perspective, but it is fundamentally one of the core tenets of such an approach is that openness, the letting be that Hannah has drawn from Sarah McLaren and made such an important part of the literature of the last few years. And as you said, Seneca, that being willing to be affected, and sort of move with rather than just against or to. In terms of the unfinishedness, some things do nevertheless have to come to an end, and I'm very aware of the time and
Very
the
nice, Marek.
lateness of the hour. So my temptation would be to allow things to just keep going, but I am very aware, as it is, of the time and the lateness. Just one comment in the chat here from Mason Cash, which refers to our earlier point about the value of a collection of those inspirational and/or gateway papers, and it's a bit of a plus one there. So it's something we might put on the back burner because if there's anything we need, it's another project. So, but if we could crowdsource that one, it's something we might ponder. So I guess just with the time upon us, I will simply say thank you very much to all of the panel for joining us, for engaging in the conversation. I do wish it didn't have to end, but I think we probably do need to move on. So
Just before you do the final closing, Marek, I just want to say thank you to you for the last sort of 10 years of
Yes.
running this. You're always been very generous with giving me some credit for that. And I did help set things up, but really it's been you that's been running this program for 10 years now, which is very impressive. So thanks for that. Awesome work.
Yes, thank you.
Very kind. But yeah, generally I just sit quietly and let other people do the talking. So it's a very easy part of the job. So actually don't underestimate how important keeping that website has been going. So thanks to Davis then as well, actually, at the who's been one of our tech support people. So listen, yeah, thanks everyone. We're not done. So there will be another ENSO seminar. We will have, after quite a bit of time, coming up next month is Xavier Barandiaran, who we haven't heard from ever in the history of the ENSO seminar. So it's great to have Xavier back and presenting with us. And we have a few more speakers coming. And Matthew, you'll be back with us in December as well. So
Right.
some coming attractions as the ENSO seminars continue, with thanks to the generous speakers. So we will hopefully see you all in a month for the next ENSO seminar.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
It was
Bye.
fun.